Alright, so let's talk about the specifics of how to take your Blender model and turn it into an MDL file that can be used in p3d or FSX. I've started off here with just your basic cube. We're not going to get fancy with this demo. I'm just going to try to familiarize you with the options that you need to set up in order to get a good p3d material. I'm assuming, by the way, that you have the Blend to FSX, or is it FSX to Blender? No, I think it's Blend to FSX plugin installed already. That was part of our initial Blender setup video that I did. So you've got that installed and configured. You've got your basic model here. There are two places where you need to pay attention. One is your basic SDK setup, and to make sure that your copy of Blender knows where to look for the SDK files and whatnot. And then the other is to set up your actual materials. So the SDK setup, if you go, when you start Blender, by default it'll be up here in the Tools menu on the right, or excuse me, the left. There should be, if you have your Blend to FSX and p3d add-on set up properly, there should be a tab somewhere in this list. On mine it's at the bottom here, specifically for p3d and FSX. At the very top of it here, it may be collapsed, but you need to open your simulator's SDK path. This is how you basically tell Blender where to find all the files it needs to compile your MDL. I'm going to use p3d SDK. You can use the version 2, 3, or 4 SDK. I've got it set on 4 here. And then, and this is very important, click the Initialize P3D Toolset button. A lot of times, like if you first open your copy of Blender, you make your model, and you think you've got everything set up right, and you go to export it and get an error. It's because every time you have a new model and a new instance of Blender, you have to click this Initialize P3D Toolset or FSX Toolset button, depending on which of these two you have selected. Once you've initialized it, then within that model and within that file, you shouldn't have to do it again, but you do have to do it the first time you create this instance of a model. Then beneath the SDK path, there is an FSX P3D animation tool. We're going to ignore that for now. I'm going to assume that you're working on a static model. We will get into animations at some point, but for now, let's leave that be. The attach point tool, again, we're not going to attach anything at the moment, although this is where you would attach an effect or like a platform. The effects and platforms are the two things that I use most often with scenery projects. I don't use no crash here, and I'll show you why, because I use Model Converter X to deal with that. So let's close that up. And then this is actually one of the most important panels, your FSX P3D file properties. And what you need to do is click the Generate GUID. This will create a new GUID specifically for this model. This will be how you reference your model when you're doing the placement XML file. And then in addition to the GUID, we're going to give it a friendly name. Let's call it just P3D Material Test. And that is the friendly name that you'll see like in MCX if you happen to open up your model, or if you have an application that uses friendly names for placement. It's just more of a human readable name to go along with the GUID. And that is more or less it for the left panels here. I am not going to use this. Technically, it's got the ability to actually place the model you create as a scenery BGL. There's latitude, longitude, altitude, pitch bank heading, all that here. I have had troubles using that recently. I don't know if it's a problem with my setup or if it's an issue with the plugin, but it tends to throw errors when I try to use it. And honestly, it's just not that hard to create the XML and do that by hand. And we'll cover that in a separate video. So I'm going to collapse that down. In fact, I'm just going to hide that panel for now. Now we have our base model, and let's create a new P3D material for this model. So let's go over here to our material tab, click the new button. We're just going to call it P3D material. I do a couple of things with these materials when I first set them up. Like I tend to turn to specular all the way down on it. That way if you forget and don't turn on the no no specular material option in the material settings here, it will still not have any shine to it. It seems as though when you export the MDL, it is assuming whatever this specularity is, unless you tell it otherwise, unless you specify a specularity map. So I just take the easy route, turn it all the way down, then it's pretty much foolproof. Alright, so this is where the rubber meets the road, the FSX P3D material params. This is what's going to make this from a normal material into an actual FSX P3D material. And here are all the different options that you have. I strongly urge you, if you haven't already been through it, to read the SDK regarding the FSX and P3D materials. It's not badly written. It's pretty informative. It tends to be fairly accurate. And it's got a lot of great examples of how to set up these various material parameters to get different looks in your models and your materials. I'm just going to kind of go through the list here from top to bottom. The Z-Test Alpha is the first panel that shows up. This is pretty much useful for things like vegetation. If you have like a double-sided cross-plane tree that you're going to use, this is a useful panel. By clicking Z-Test Alpha and saying, for instance, the most common one I use is greater equal. Using greater than equal and then putting a number in here, let's say 128. Essentially what you're telling the engine is when it looks at the alpha channel for that particular model, everything that is greater or equal to a value of 128 or sort of a middle gray in your alpha channel will be treated as a transparent area. Now this does mean that if you're using, for instance, a DXT3 or 5 image and you want a soft gradation, that you won't be able to do that. It's going to cut it off at a hard line. It's going to treat everything above that value as transparent, and therefore will draw things behind it. It's going to treat everything lower than that value as opaque. And so where you get into issues is maybe you've seen where you've created trees or grass or vegetation or whatnot, and when you see it in the sim, it's got a little halo around it where the objects that are behind that grass or behind that tree don't show up. That's because the alpha test level is set in such a way that it's actually treating part of the transparency of the image, because it's greater, a smaller, lower value than 128. It's treating it as opaque, but it's not opaque. You know, you can see through the image still, but because it's being treated as opaque, it's blocking out the models that are behind it. It's culling, the engine is on the fly. So just be sure if you use this that you want to have a hard-edged alpha. And that's usually, almost always, used with DXT1 textures that have just a 1-bit alpha channel. The bloom settings, I haven't really played with much. I haven't done a whole lot of work with bloom, although theoretically you could both either allow or disallow bloom for your objects. And there are some a bunch of options here that I'm not really that familiar with, I have to be honest. But you could play with them. I'm sure you could read up on them in the SDK and figure that all out. The emissive mode is almost always set to additive night only, which means it's going to add the values of your LM textures, your night textures, to the existing day textures during night only, so during dawn, dusk, and night. I have not found a good reason to stray from this. I almost always leave it at this setting, so you don't really have to touch that. There are a bunch of enhanced parameters here. Assume vertical normal is useful for things that you don't want to be shaded. That's almost always like cross-plane trees or grass. Basically, it treats the model as if all the normals were facing straight up, as if they were flat on the ground. So no matter where the sun is in the sky, is going to give it a pretty similar shading, which is going to kind of hide the fact that it's a cross plane and make it look more like a three-dimensional object. It is also, the trade-off, of course, is that it's not going to have quite the subtlety of shading that it would have during the day, as if it were a full 3D model, but very useful for trees and grass. Double-sided I use a fair amount, and that's usually in conjunction with this. That is exactly what it sounds like. You can have a single-sided material and it will automatically make it double-sided. Very careful. Be very careful how you deal with that one though, because it's double-sided, it's going to take the shading of whatever the actual native normal is. So say you have a cross-plane tree and one of your planes faces due north, and then you click double-sided. Essentially, both sides of that plane are going to be shaded as if they were facing due north. So when the sun is in the north, that normal is going to be lit brightly, even if it's on the back side of the tree, which is technically facing south. So it's just a little thing to bear in mind. A lot of times, especially with X-Plane, but even with p3d now, instead of using the double-sided option, I'm actually duplicating the geometry and flipping the normals. Because when you do that, then each of the normals is properly shaded. You don't have to deal with that weird shading anomaly. It might save you some trouble later. Don't really use many of these. The no base material specular, you can click that. Theoretically, it should mean that there is no specularity at all, no shininess to your object when you export it. I have found that if the specularity is turned on in that earlier Blender panel that I showed you, sometimes this doesn't necessarily work, but it's not a bad thing to keep checked normally, unless, of course, and of course, if you do have a specular map, then you don't have to worry about this. Either way, either checked or not checked, it's still going to show your specularity based on your map. No shadow is just what it sounds like. It just stops the object from throwing a shadow. That's less useful in p3d than it used to be in FSX. In FSX, we used to use it for vegetation because it couldn't take into account alpha channels when it would draw a shadow. Now that we have p3d, especially with p3d has the option to override this no shadow, so the user can say generate shadows even for things that say no shadow. It's less useful than it used to be. I tend to just not worry about it, not ever turn it on. No Z-Write is very useful if you're going to be using Z-Index. It's almost exclusively used for ground polys. So if you have a whole bunch of flat planes on the ground that are stacked on top of one another that are essentially coplanar, that take up the same space as we do with ground polys, you have to take no Z-Write and then go down to the panel that actually where you can put in the Z-index and stack your Z-indices for each of the various polys. But if you don't have no Z-Write turned on, it'll ignore your Z-indexing. So if you wonder why things are flashing or things aren't in the right order, check and make sure you've got no Z-Write checked for your ground polys. For anything else, I haven't found it to be terribly useful. Skinned mesh is useful if you have an armature with bones and an animated mesh. We won't get into that here, but you do have to check that if that's something you've created. And the Z-Write alpha is useful if you have DXT3 textures. So say you created trees or grass and you don't want to turn on the Z-Test alpha up here, but you want to try to resolve some of the problems that happen with sort of self-culling, self-occlusion that you get with models that use softer alpha channels. Z-Write alpha can help eliminate some of those issues. So if you export your model and it appears to be inside out, which happens a lot if one of the materials in your model is a DXT3 or 5 texture and has alpha channels, then try taking Z-Write alpha and see if that doesn't fix the problem. Generally it does. The alpha blend, I really just don't mess with. I haven't messed with that much at all. Frame buffer blend is just basically what it says, either opaque or transparent. Fresnel ramps can theoretically be very useful, but I haven't been able to get them to work quite right, so I tend to ignore those. We'll go into that more in depth later. The precipitation, the take into account button here, can be useful. If you create a roof of a building, say, or a ground poly, this comes in handy with a lot, and you click take into account on the precipitation, and you have an alpha channel and some glossiness to your object, it will essentially give it that wet pavement look or that wet roof look when there is precipitation in your scene. So that can be handy, mostly for ground polys. Special functionality is mostly dealing with blending your reflections, your reflective maps, and your specularity. I think I covered this earlier, but I'll go through it here one more time. Basically, blend diffuse by options here, I don't really use much. They may have some uses, I've just never encountered it. The two that I do use a lot are the blend environment by. Blend environment map, that refers to your environment map, which is essentially the reflection that you get in your object. And you can click blend environment by inverse of diffuse alpha to do just what it says, basically have the black areas of your diffuse alpha channel be treated as reflective areas and the white areas as not. Or if you have transparency in your object, so you're using your alpha channel for your diffuse for transparency already, you can create a specular map for your object and click blend environment by specular map alpha. But you'll notice that with the diffuse, it's by the inverse of the diffuse. But when you're using a specular, it's by the specular map alpha, which means then the white areas would be the ones that were reflective and the black areas would be the ones that weren't, because it's inverse of inverse, if that makes any sense. Your reflection scale, as I said before, it's actually a scale of 0 to 1, so I don't know why it starts with 100 here. I usually do 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, somewhere like that, to get a pretty good glass reflection. And the specular map power scale is kind of how hot you want the specularity to be. So a glass, the specularity on a piece of glass would be a very hot little single point. Whereas if it was something that was a little less reflective, like a piece of sort of brushed metal, then the power scale would be much lower, like 32 or even 24 or down from there, and it would spread out that specularity and make it a little softer to kind of get that effect. And then down here, global environment map is reflection. It's just to say use the built-in environment map for your reflections. Always leave that checked unless you're specifying your own environment map, in which case leave it off. If you don't have an environment map specified and you don't click this either one, it doesn't know what to do for reflections, so it just won't do any reflecting. So if you load your object and you think it was supposed to be highly reflective and it's not, it's either because you forgot to specify your environment map or you forgot to take this box, one or the other. The p3d4 specific stuff I'm not even going to get into. It's all pretty new and I don't even really understand an awful lot of it. A lot of this assumes being able to have multiple UV channels, which would be wonderful, except for I can't seem to get this exporter to actually export multiple channels, and from what I've seen on the forums, nobody else can either. So just ignore those for now. And then the last little bit here that you'll need to worry about, remember how I said up here, if you're going to do your ground polys and you use no Z-Write, down here, this is the Z-bias is where you actually control the layering of things. So like your base pavement would be -8. These are all negative values, by the way. -8, or if you had, if the base pavement was -8, then maybe markings would be -12. And then any overlays that were like dirt and grime could be -16. They stack up like that. I tend to separate them by a value about a factor of 4. I don't know if that's necessary. I know for the longest time in earlier versions of p3d, you had to space them kind of wide. It seems like they've dialed the engine in so that you don't have to necessarily do that now. So anyway, that is all. Those are all the material settings, and then of course you can't just have a material. You also need to add some textures to it. So let me just open up. Let's do our good old glass test here that I was working on. How about let's just use our diffuse texture here. Oh, and let me unwrap this guy. Unwrap it. And I'm going to, once unwrapped, choose that glass texture in my UV image editor. When I go back here, you'll see it's applied and ready to go. There is a kind of a weirdness that to be aware of in Blender, and that is that you can choose a different material, a different texture in your UV image editor than you've specified here in your material. And if you do that, it'll look perfectly fine in the viewport here, but when you export the object, it's going to use whatever texture is actually set up here in your material settings. So you can contradict yourself if you're not careful. So just be sure in your UV image editor that you've chosen the same image as the material it's using here for the diffuse. That being said, the only other things you could do, you could, if you needed to add, for instance, let's add a normal map into that. Choose a normal map, and then what we'd have to do, in addition to adding the image in here, is go down to the Influence tab, or the Influence area, and untick Diffuse Color and tick Normal Geometry. Or, for instance, if we wanted to add a night texture, click this, and we would pick our night texture, and then under Influence, instead of Diffuse Color, we would choose, under Shading, we choose Emit for the emission texture. Things like that. So, and the same thing if you were to choose, for instance, a specular map, is you would untick Color and you would click Specular Intensity. So it's just you just always have to make sure your influence here matches the use that you're putting your texture to up here. And once you've done all that, let's open up here. Once you've set up everything on the left hand side here, initialized your SDK, given your model its GUID and its friendly name, then all you have to do is go down to Export. You should have DirectX for FSX P3D, and then it'll give you the name of the X file here. There are some options down to the lower left under Export FSX X file. By the way, it always says FSX even if you're doing P3D. You can apply modifiers from the modifier stack. For instance, if you have arrays or mirrors or things like that, it will apply them before it exports. If you were using animations or LODs, there's an option for that. If you're using a skinned mesh, there's an option for that. And I always leave Export MDL set on, which means that once you export, it doesn't just do the X file, it actually compiles that into an MDL file that you can use to place into your sim and export it, and it's done. And that's pretty much all there is to setting up an object and exporting it as an MDL.